Welcome to the very first episode of the Palestine Pod, the weekly podcast where we break down the latest headlines dealing with Palestine and bring you stories, commentary, and interviews with the aim of spreading awareness about the Palestinian struggle for justice and equal rights.
Yeah, that was much better when you did it. Welcome, everybody. My name is Mikey B. You may know me as Michael Schertzer or Mikey Intifada if you're Hasbara.
My name is Lara E. You might know me from Instagram as @GazanGirl. And for this very first episode, we wanted to introduce ourselves to you, our viewers, and share with you what drove us to create this space, this podcast.
Tell me about yourself and how you got into, well, you're obviously Palestinian, but tell me how you got into activism.
Well, I mean, being Palestinian, I'm obviously, since a very young age, I've been acutely aware that my family had gone through something that led to our removal from our homeland, and in particular, our inability to go back. And, at the same time, the food that we ate at home and, the Arabic dialect that we spoke at home and, the embroidered dresses, that we would be gifted for holidays, all of that was Palestinian, but yet this place, Palestine, we were away from it. And, there was no plan to go back. Not because we didn't want to, but simply because we were not allowed to. And so I became curious to learn that story, our personal story and why we couldn't go back. And I came to learn, that it was because part of our homeland was under a very brutal military occupation, and the rest of it had been turned into a state that would not allow us to go back to our homes because we were not Jewish. And if we go back in time to about 100 years ago, my great-grandmother and her family were from the city of Jaffa. And in the 1920s, they moved to Gaza. And at the time, these two cities were Palestine, right? So today, Jaffa is considered Israel. And of course, Gaza is its own separate, fragmented entity. But at the time, it was all Palestine. And, there's only about 40 miles that separate the two cities, but they could not be more different from one another today in their conditions.
Yes.
And so my grandparents were born and grew up in Gaza, all four of them. And as a result of the creation of the state of Israel, on top of the majority of historic Palestine, large numbers of Palestinian refugees were pushed out of their cities, which became Israel. And many of them were pushed down into Gaza, but of course also the West Bank and neighboring Arab countries. And large, swaths of Gazan farmland was also taken and eventually became part of Israel. Around the 50s or so, the situation in Gaza was pretty difficult, my grandfather tells me. And eventually my grandparents settled in Kuwait in 1955, and they were never allowed to go back to Gaza. But also living in Kuwait, they were never allowed to become citizens. So my parents were born stateless, which is a very common feature of the Palestinian story. This is not at all a unique situation. In fact, many millions of Palestinians today remain stateless. And I too was born stateless in Kuwait. And so, there was this notion of, okay, well, so I guess we'll just live here as long as they let us live here, right? And we'll be stateless. And that's, what the plan was. But then in 1990, following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, we had to flee Kuwait. And so here we are, made refugees once again. And that's how we ended up in the US. And I ended up growing up in the suburbs of Chicago. And so when I look back on my own personal story in the last few, generations, I see that it's one that's marked by displacement and statelessness and forced exile. And I think to say that this affected me is really an understatement, because actually the entire outcome of my life was fundamentally altered because of the creation of the state of Israel on top of Palestine. And, the same goes for the other 13 million Palestinians in the world. And as I mentioned, we are the world's largest refugee population. And so I think it was a combination of a lot of things, my personal story, but also just this feeling of being like really profoundly disturbed by all forms of injustice, and then feeling, a human responsibility to speak out against injustice, but also a very unique and personal responsibility as a Palestinian-American who had this space and who had a voice in a country that was very specifically responsible for what was taking place in Palestine. And for those of our listeners who don't know, the US gives Israel every year $3.8 or so billion in aid. Israel's the world's largest recipient of US foreign aid. And the latest aid package, the $38 billion aid package over 10 years, was actually signed by the Obama administration. The United States frequently and almost without fail shields Israel from any form of criticism, whether it be in the United Nations by exercising its veto power when it can, or just on the world stage more generally.
When the International Criminal Court recently came out and said that they were thinking about investigating Israel for war crimes, which everybody knows they're guilty of, the United States did pretty much everything but throw actual bodies in front of the investigation.
Several U.S. officials have come out with statements condemning, the investigation by the ICC, the idea that the ICC would have jurisdiction, and that was the specific ruling, is that the ICC has jurisdiction to investigate war crimes in the occupied territories, so in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. Israel and its supporters immediately came out condemning this decision. Netanyahu called it fake war crimes, I think was the term he used. And he accused everybody of anti-Semitism for...
He said, when the International Criminal Court makes eye contact with an Israeli, that is anti-Semitism.
That's a joke. That's not what he said. We have to say that, because then they'll say, oh, you misreported. They'll say that you made something up.
Guys, I'm a comedian, so I will occasionally be making jokes on the podcast. And then as a lawyer, she will be letting people know that they are jokes.
I'll be correcting you, and I will be limiting our liability for defamatory statements.
And that is why we work well together. Okay.
Exactly. But yeah, so that's the thing, is like, I'm just a human that's disturbed by injustice. And I see that I have a unique role being Palestinian, but being American, to address that injustice. And so I feel like I have to do whatever I can to try to remedy that. When I was in college, I was also making these connections between militarism and imperialism. And I was really involved in the anti-war groups at my university. So I was constantly organizing rallies, speaking at rallies, protesting the US-led wars on Afghanistan and Iraq, and making the connection between that militarism and also US support for Israel. So that for me was, really essential. And also like reading also at the time, Noam Chomsky, Norman Finkelstein, Ilan Pappé, Rashid Khalidi, obviously Edward Said.
The Question of Palestine.
Yeah. So, these were the books that really formed my sort of, awareness of the issue, like between the age of 18 to 22.
Palestine Pod. Palestine Pod. Sit back and relax. Palestine Pod. Expand your mind. Palestine Pod.